Hey guys, I'm here to talk to you about the patterns of evolution. And so the first learning target statement is I can list the patterns seen in evolution. And so a pattern is anything that we see happening over and over and over again. And so the patterns that we have seen in evolution are convergent evolution, divergent evolution, coevolution, extinction, and punctuated equilibrium. So that's all that one's asking you is can you list them? The next two deal with convergent evolution, and it is I can explain convergent evolution and I can describe how analogous structures are evidence for convergent evolution. So convergent evolution, to converge means to come together. So convergent evolution is when you have two organisms that are not related, or not recently related, I should say, and then over time they become more similar because they live in a similar environment. And a good example of that, here's a bunch of examples, but a good example of that would be, my favorite example, I should say, would be the shark, the ichthyosaur, and the dinosaur. The ichthyosaur was a dinosaur. The dolphin. These are completely different. So the shark is a fish. The ichthyosaur is a reptile, so it evolved on land and moved back into the water, and the dolphin is a mammal, also evolved on land and moved back into the water. And so they have very different origins, at least recently-ish speaking, but they have some very similar traits. They all have a dorsal fin. They're all hydrodynamically shaped, kind of torpedo shaped. They all have counter shading, which means they have a dark top and a light back. They all have tail flukes, which are just their tail fins. And all of these things are helping them survive in their environment, helping them move through the water, go after their prey, all of those kinds of things. So that is what convergent evolution is. It is when different organisms, like a shark and a dolphin, get some of the same traits, like a dorsal fin, but they did not inherit them from a common ancestor, because the ancestor of a dolphin was kind of a wolf-like creature. It didn't have a dorsal fin. So the gene for dorsal fin was not there. And once that moved back into the water, at some point there were mutations that gave this little nub, and that helped it a little bit. And then so maybe they mated with another one with a little nub and made a bigger nub until eventually you got the dorsal fin. If that had not happened, they would not have a dorsal fin. So it's not like they can say, oh, I really need a dorsal fin, and it'll give them one. That's not how it works. It is just random mutations that benefit the organism. An analogous structure are these structures that make you think they're related, like the dorsal fin, like the counter shading, the tail flukes, the hydrodynamic shape of their body. But those actually came from different mutation events or different evolutionary events. So the fish, the ancestor to the shark, well, the shark is a fish, but if we go back to the one that gave rise to the shark, it probably did have some of these features because it was in the water. But like I said, the dolphin evolved from a almost wolf dog-like creature, and so it was not hydrodynamically shaped. It did not have a dorsal fin. It did not have tail flukes. It may have been counter shaded, but in a different way because it had fur. And so, but I guess the skin underneath is still kind of counter shaded, because if you think about cats and dogs, a lot of times their bellies are lighter than their backs. And so the fact that the dolphin has a dorsal fin and the shark has a dorsal fin is not evidence of a common ancestor, because they did not get that from a common ancestor. They got it from separate evolutionary events or separate sets of mutations that happened after they split. Wings are another example. Wings of birds, wings of insects. All right, the second pattern is is divergent evolution, also known as adaptive radiation, and that is honestly what AP tends to prefer. They tend to prefer the term adaptive radiation, so I will try to use that more. But I can explain divergent evolution or adaptive radiation. This is the opposite of convergent. Okay, so this picture is convergent. Different ancestors give similar species. Divergent is where you have a recent common ancestor, and it has diverged or broken into species or speciated into more than one species. And so when you look at these, they are going to have structures that are from a common ancestor. So like we said with the shark, the dorsal fin, the shark and the dolphin, the dorsal fin was not from a common ancestor. When you're looking at divergent evolution, you're looking at structures that are coming from a common ancestor, but they have changed over time to give the organisms a better chance of survival in their environment. And so it says, I can explain divergent evolution. So it's just when a common ancestor splits or speciates into multiple species, and those species slowly accumulate mutations that make them more and more different so that they can fit better into their environment. I can explain why divergent evolution adaptive radiation often occurs rapidly after a mass extinction. So what happens, and this is not I don't have a good picture for this, but what we tend to see is after a mass extinction, so every organism occupies what's called a niche or a niche. And that is basically where it fits in the food chain, where it lives. Does it live in the trees? Does it live in the water? Does it live, on the ground or whatever? It's basically everything about how that organism fits into its environment. Is it a predator? Is it a parasite? Is it, a producer, like a plant? Those kinds of things. When mass extinction occurs, what happens is a lot of those niches get emptied. Right? If that species dies out and it fit this particular niche, now that that species is gone, that niche is open. And so where previously, before the mass extinction, let's say this other species had a mutation that enabled it to fill this niche, but that niche was already filled, then now they're competing. And let's say that competition, the original species wins, and so this mutation dies out. Now, fast forward to after the mass extinction, that mutation arises again, that species is gone, this niche is now open, and now that species can get in there with that mutation and inhabit that niche because that competition is gone, because that species is gone, the first species. So that's kind of how we see these mutation events that may not survive when there's lots of creatures. Those mutations might be able to survive after mass extinction. And you can see after the mass extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous period, which is when all the dinosaurs died, look at how mammals took over. So mammals were around, but there weren't a lot of them. And then after the dinosaurs were gone, those mammals took over, right? And that's when we saw that happen. Actually, that's when mammals became kind of the main organism on Earth. All right, so that is divergent evolution and mass extinction. I can explain how homologous structures are evidence for divergent evolution. So when we talk about homologous structures, what we're talking about is we're talking about structures that two organisms have because they're closely related and they got it from a common ancestor. Okay, so not like the dorsal fin of a shark and a dolphin, but like the humerus of a human and a whale. Okay, so human humerus, top of your arm, whale humerus, top of the flipper. Notice they are shaped differently. Let me make that a little bigger. Because mutations that have benefited the whale have not benefited the human. And so those mutations did not survive here. They did survive here. And so over time, what you saw is the humerus and the radius and ulna got short and fat to give that nice wide flipper. Now there were probably tons of mutations that did different things, that made these bones longer or something that didn't help the whale, and the whale died. So these mutations were just the ones that helped the whale, and therefore those whales survived and passed them down. Look at their fingers. They look very much like ours. Of course, way, way, way bigger. But those are actually tucked in their flipper. So when you look at a whale flipper, it's covering all of these phalanges. Okay? So those homologous structures, the fact that a whale has a humerus and a human has a humerus and a dog and a bird, all suggest that we have a common ancestor that gave us the genes for that humerus. And so that's why we all have one, because the Hox gene that said, hey, build a humerus, is present in all of us. And why do we have genes? We get them from our parents. Why do they have genes? They got them from their parents. So we can assume if we all have the same structure and the same genes for that same structure, then it suggests that we have a common ancestor. Now, obviously, we go way back with birds. We don't have a recent common ancestor with birds. We do have a recent common ancestor with whales and dogs because they're mammals. Okay, the next is I can explain the process of coevolution. Coevolution is often seen in symbiotic relationships. And so what we have here is we have a crab and a snail, and the crab eats the snail. And so the crab eats the snail, everybody's happy, whatever, yada, yada. Well, the snail's not happy, he's dead. But this snail has a mutation, right? This mama snail gives birth. No, has eggs, and the eggs hatch, and her baby has these little spines on the shell, and she's like, what is wrong with my baby? But when the crab comes around, the mama gets eaten because she didn't have the spines, but the baby doesn't because he does have the spines, and so that survived and got passed down, and now the crabs are having trouble eating the snails because their shells are thicker and spiny. Then I want you to look at the claws on these crabs, okay? Then some crab had a mutation that gave them a bigger claw. Bigger means stronger, okay, in a crab's world. And so now this mutated crab with this big claw, whose mama thought, oh, everybody's going to make fun of my crab baby on the playground because his claws are big. He actually gets the advantage because his bigger claw can crack into this thicker shell. And so over time, what we've seen is we've seen the shells get thicker and spinier, and we've seen the crab claws get larger, not because they wanted to, not because they said, hey, if I had a thick spiny shell, the crab couldn't eat me. Or, hey, if I had a thicker claw, I could get into that to that snail. But simply because those are the mutations that benefited them, and so those mutations got to hang around. Other mutations may have made their shells thinner, and those mutations would have been negative and would not have been passed down. So that's coevolution. If this crab had not had a mutation that gave it a bigger claw, then this relationship would have been broken. The crab would have had to go find something else to eat. And the snails would have taken over the world because there'd be too many of them. So I'm just kidding. All right, so that's coevolution. So they're evolving kind of in response to each other, but it's not on purpose. That's the biggest thing. You have to be really careful in the language of evolution because you can very easily cross the border into making it sound like it's on purpose. So it's not. It's just kind of accidental, random, but it does help the crab if they get the mutation. But if they don't, then they don't. All right, the next one is extinction. Extinction is the permanent removal of a species from Earth. It's gone for good. These are some extinct animals. Of course, dinosaurs, you know. The woolly mammoth, you probably know. The saber-toothed cat, you may not know a lot about that. Saber-toothed tiger, you'll hear it called. It was actually a marsupial, so it has a little pouch down here. Here's the thylacine, or Tasmanian tiger. There are people who think this is still alive. There are people who say they have seen it recently. It's in Australia. Don't know if I believe that or not, but we'll see. Time will tell. The dodo bird, of course, extinct. The golden toad, that's a more recent extinction. The passenger pigeon, I think, was 1920s. The last one was named Martha, and when she died, they went extinct. And then a ground sloth. So it's kind of most sloths live in trees. This was one that lived on the ground. And there's bunches of others. You can also, I didn't pull this up, but you can also go to the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, and you can type in any species you want and see if, let's see, the white rhino, and see where they, how they're doing, what they're doing. And so let me pull that up really quick, and then we'll talk about punctuated equilibrium. So it is decreasing. That's its population kind of status. Is that still, I don't know if that's still working or not. Usually it tells you, let's do another one. Let's go back and look at, I'll just pull up something that's theoretically healthy. So the jaguar is decreasing. LC means least concern. And so those different categories for different things. But anyway, so if you want to look up different organisms, you can do that. You can check out things like that. So that's the IUCN Red List. Very interesting site. All right, and then the last one is punctuated equilibrium. And punctuated equilibrium, we've talked about this before. Equilibrium is a balance, or staying the same. Punctuated means it is broken up, right? That's what we use punctuation for, is to break up our words and make them into sentences. So punctuated equilibrium is often contrasted to gradualism. Gradualism says that this little butterfly, moth, whatever, accumulated small mutations here and there until eventually they were different species, and those species kept accumulating small mutations until they became different. Punctuated equilibrium says we had this species, something happened, we had these random mutations, and quickly, and by quickly I mean like 50,000 years, what we would not consider quickly, but geologically speaking is quickly, they broke into different species. And so there's not a lot of change for maybe millions of years, and then all of a sudden in 50,000 years we got 3 species going. So that's punctuated equilibrium. So you have these long periods of no change or very little change broken up by these bursts of change, and then you'll see another long period where these didn't change. And that's that. So those are the patterns. If you have questions, let me know.